just as you were talking earlier, often in New Zealand, I think we've been captivated by this idea of October 7th and that being the pivotal moment. But the more I understand, the more I read, and the more I talk to people, I think that is not a good lens. And you've mentioned, like, going back to 1948, what happened there. I don't know if many of us in New Zealand have a good understanding of that history and therefore to make sense of the present day. So do you want to take us back to, what was the foundational moments of where we are now?
Yes, so I think if you talk to any Palestinian, one of the kind of in the first hour that you meet, if you talk about history, they'll say Nakba, this word. And Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. And it's one of the most kind of, I think, if not the most, we'll see about the current events, but I think it's the most central kind of focal point for all of Palestinian history. And it needs to be understood both as kind of a specific point in time, what happened in 1948, and I'll speak about what happened there, but also Palestinians, we view it as a process that continues until today. Like when something happens, we say, oh, this is another Nakba, this is another event in the long process of Nakba, of catastrophe, that we're living through as people. So the Nakba as a historical event refers to kind of the mass displacement, dispossession of Palestinians in 1948. This is what Israelis will refer to as the war of establishment or war of independence. And so between 1947 and 1949, kind of just before the war and just after the Nakba, just after the war, over 750,000 Palestinians, who were kind of the majority of the Palestinian population at the time, were violently expelled or driven out of their homes by Zionist militias who were later consolidated into the Israeli army, the Haganah and others. So we're looking at entire communities that were emptied through military assault, through intimidation, through massacres. Some people will maybe have heard of kind of, for example, the Deir Yassin massacre. This was a village in Palestine that where, over 100 civilian Palestinians were killed by Zionist militias. And kind of it's only one village, but then the news of what happened in that village would travel to other villages and would drive people out. And it kind of accelerated the mass exodus. So overall, between those years, more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages were depopulated, destroyed, or resettled with Jewish immigrants. So you'll hear a lot of Palestinian refugees, for example, say, yeah, my grandfather's house in Jaffa is still standing, and we know the building, we know the place. If they were lucky enough to come and visit, sometimes they would go and knock on the door and see who's living there now. But, we have the deeds to these buildings, to these places, if they were not destroyed, like, in different places, of course, they were destroyed. For example, in just outside Nazareth, there's a small village called Safuriyya. And Safuriyya is used to be kind of a central village right next to Nazareth. And all of the people of Safuriyya were driven out of their homes in 1948, and they settled in a neighborhood that's kind of just outside Nazareth and really close to their original village, and now it's called Safafri because they came from Safuriyya. So these are the people of Safuriyya, and they can point out their homes exactly, but that village was destroyed and is now a national park, and there's a small Tsipori village there. And, there are some historical remains and so on. So it's very stark, like we're not talking about very old history, and it's history that you live all the time. You go somewhere and you see the remains and you're like, oh, they're most probably Palestinian remains.
I'm just
and it should
interested,
be
just for a moment, the international response to that massive injustice of 750,000 Palestinians being removed back then, did it just get ignored? What happened?
Largely, yes. The countries, um, recognized the newly established state of Israel, and kind of its yeah, and maybe paid some lip service to the right of return for Palestinians. And across the years, there were some UN resolutions saying, the Palestinian refugees should be able to return home, but that remains a dream, and without any real push behind it, there's no way it's going to happen. And let's not go back to the Nakba, like in 1948. There are people now, like in the West Bank, who are being driven out of their homes, and Jewish settlers come in and build whole settlements that are illegal under international law. And a lot of the Western European countries say that it's illegal, but they still don't do anything to stop it. So we're not talking even, a 70-year history. We're talking about 1 year, 2 year, 20 years, where people have not been able to return to their land, to their homes.
That's one of the interesting things
Oh,
you're
you go,
seeing
Cole.
in the West Bank at the moment as well, right? So there's dozens of these refugee camps now throughout the West Bank, throughout Gaza. I think around 80% of Gaza are refugees who are displaced from their homes in what is now Israel. More refugee camps also in southern Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. And a lot of the refugee camps in the northern West Bank at the moment, since early this year, there've been like really large military operations being done there that are essentially have permanently displaced over 40,000 people. I think in Tulkarm and Jenin, which are kind of two of the main centers in the north of the West Bank. The entire refugee camps have been emptied and are now being demolished. And I think it's kind of part of this real pattern that you see with like the erasure of these camps, because it's an inconvenient reality for the Israeli narrative that actually you still have today hundreds of thousands of people living in these camps that have very limited infrastructure, very limited rights, and are still held as refugee status because they don't have the right to return to their homes, or they do have that right, but they haven't had that right honored by Israel or by the international community.
So,
And a lot
so
of people,
since you go.
no, it's just a lot of people still carry like either the actual physical key to their homes, or a symbol.
Wow,
Like you'll see in Palestine, you'll see a lot of
wow.
times just the key of return. It's become the symbol of, and actually in Gaza, for example, a lot of people say about the people in Gaza, Gazans. And a lot of people don't like that because they're like, we're not Gazans. I'm originally, my grandfather is from Jaffa or from Ascalon, which is today Ashkelon. So like, there's all of these connections that have been
So
severed
this is just
by
another relocation and another removal from the land. This is just the next episode. So from 48 to today, this has just been a systemic removal of people from land and Israeli settlements coming in and replacing it. That's sort of the
yeah.
history.
Yeah, and it's a logic of, as few Palestinians as possible on as little land as possible. So it started, so 1948 happened, and then 1950, for example, two really important laws were passed. The first is the Absentee Property Law. So this allowed the state of Israel, to seize the homes and land of Palestinians, even if they were still within the borders of Israel. So, for example, the people of Safuriyya, they were just around the corner. But the state said, if you're not on your land in a specific day, then we're going to seize that land. The ironic part, or the paradoxical part, is that people were under military rule. They couldn't be on their land. So they used this trick in order to be able to seize the land, the property. So they seized most of the property then, and they continue to seize land today. And then the second really important part, which connects to the law of return, the right of return, which we were speaking about, is the law of return that allowed any Jewish person around the world to come to Israel and to claim citizenship of Israel, granting them right to housing, right to vote, right to, all of these things if you have a Jewish ancestry, while Palestinians who had just been pushed out of their homes weren't granted that right. So we're talking about a very stark system of discrimination, apartheid, whatever you want to call it.
I think
Again,
it's
we
like
can see history in New Zealand of a similar sort of early days colonization sort of. Yeah, there's lots of similarities in some sense. Sorry, Cole, you were saying?
Oh no, well, I was actually just going to draw one of the parallels there to Parihaka in New Zealand.
Yes.
You know, peaceful Māori settlement known for its kind of non-violent resistance to the laws that have been put in place by the state to take land, and yet the response from the state was one of violence and displacement that essentially imprisoned and displaced most of the communities from there. And I think it's a really relevant Christian link as well as speaking about the towns of Ikrit and Birim. I visited Ikrit twice earlier this year. It's a town right up north by the border with Lebanon, right up in the north of Israel. And it was a Christian village prior to the Nakba. And they, when the Israeli Zionist gangs kind of arrived, they didn't resist. They said, "We're not going to fight you," and instead kind of were told, "Okay, well, you're not going to fight us, but you need to leave." And they said, "Well, we'd quite like not to leave," but they were basically told, "Well, we're telling you to leave. So we just need your land for 2 weeks and then you can return." So they left. And 2 weeks later, they tried to return and were told, no, we need another 2 weeks. And so 2 more weeks passed, and then months. And then 2 years later, they still had not been allowed to return to their village. And they took it to the Israeli High Court, the newly established High Court that ruled that the military had to allow them to return to their village. And instead, on Christmas Eve in 1950, the military went in and demolished the entire village with bombs and with bulldozers until only the church remains. And the church still remains there today, and it's a national park. There's nothing else there, nothing physical preventing people from actually returning, but they're not given that right to return. And that's kind of another cool parallel with New Zealand, is they've started this initiative kind of like up in Ihumātao in Auckland, where they, from kind of 2014 onwards, went to kind of reoccupy the land to just exist and have a consistent presence there, to exert their right to return just by returning, essentially. But they still haven't been given the right to return in anything other than being buried in the village cemetery. So they say the only way they can return is horizontal.
So what I'm hearing is it's really important that we have the discipline to see October 7th and post October 7th in light of the whole history. And in some senses, our whole complicitness in the history where, we were silent in the Nakba. We were, UN made some resolutions, but never really had any power behind them, so to speak. So, it's important that we keep that big history and don't sort of fall into the trap of being simplistic and reductionist in our sort of understanding.